This video provides an overview of compound ternary form. First, we'll briefly review binary and simple ternary. Then we'll talk about compound ternary in terms of its definition and its characteristics. And then we'll look at two compound ternary movements. One is a set of menuets from Les Indes Galantes by Jean-Philippe Rameau, and the other is the famous Raindrop Prelude by Chopin. First, let's briefly review binary and simple ternary. Binary form has two parts. In a simple binary, the first and the second parts do not necessarily have the same thematic material. As you can see here, I've represented this with an A for the first section and a B for the second section, showing that the two differ in terms of thematic content. Naturally, they also will differ in terms of harmonic content as well. A subtype of simple binary called parallel binary has similar thematic content in the first and the second halves, but the second half has a very different harmonic structure and it might rework many of the motives that were first introduced in the first A section. Hence, the second half of this binary form I've represented with the A prime, showing that there's been some sort of alteration in comparison to the first part. Rounded binary is interesting because there's this moment somewhere in the second part of the binary form where there's a double return of the opening theme at the opening pitch level. So the A that starts in tonic at the beginning of the binary form will return in some guise in the second half of the binary form. The opening theme will come back and it will come back in the same key. So that return of the tonic key at the same moment of the melodic reprise is very important in order to establish a rounded binary form. Simple ternary has three sections like a rounded binary, A, B, A, but what's different about a simple ternary is that first of all, the ternary lacks the repeat signs of a rounded binary. So as you can see, a rounded binary groups the B and the last A section together into one chunk based on the repeat scheme, as opposed to simple ternary, which has the A, B, and A that are pretty much fairly equally weighted. The second difference between rounded binary and simple ternary has to do with the B sections of each. In rounded binary, the B section typically is a mini development of sorts. It'll feature fragmentation, some sort of dominant prolongation, especially towards the end of it, getting ready for the return of the A material and the tonic key. The B section in a simple ternary is typically more heavily weighted than the B section in a rounded binary, so it's more likely to be a bit longer. It's more likely to be in its own key, a contrasting key. So for example, simple ternary pieces often will change keys between the first A section and that B section. That B section might be in something like the subdominant or the submediant or any number of other options, but it's more likely to have a strong thematic and key center contrast with the opening and closing A sections. Now, with all of that in mind, let's talk about compound ternary. Compound ternary, which is sometimes called composite ternary, is a ternary form in which the A and or B sections are in binary or ternary form. Typically, both the A and the B sections would be in one of those two forms. So for example, the most common variant of this is you'll have a first little binary form, then a second binary form, and then at the end of the piece, it'll come back to that first binary form. So A, B, A, in which A is a binary form, B is a binary form, and then the return to A is a return to that original binary form. There are other variants, of course. All three of the components, both the outer A's and the inner B, could be ternary forms, or you might have a combination where the A sections are binary forms and the B section is a ternary, or the reverse of that, where the A sections are ternaries and the B section is a binary. All of those are possible. The most common, though, however, is the combination of two binary forms. Most compound ternary movements are full sectional. And remember, full sectional means that every single large section in this, the A by itself, the B by itself, the A by itself, is tonally closed. In other words, each of those sections starts and ends in the same key, and it ends with some sort of authentic cadence in that particular key for that section. This makes sense because if you have a binary form, most binary forms are going to be totally closed, right? And then you're just concatenating those. It means that each of those sections is going to wind up being tonally closed. However, that is not necessarily always the case. It is possible to have a sectional compound ternary. It is possible to have a continuous compound ternary. They do exist in the repertoire. They are just less frequent. Sectional compound ternaries are probably a little bit more common than continuous compound ternaries, but again, you can find both of those subtypes if you look hard enough in the literature. On to common places to find compound ternary movements. Probably the most well-known place is any type of movement that combines two dances together, so anything that's built on a pair of dances. So this is particularly common in movements from the traditional Baroque suite, so two bourrées, two gavottes, two sarabands, any of those Baroque dances that come in pairs are likely to be in a compound ternary form. So you'll have dance number 1, followed by dance number 2, followed by a return to dance number 1 for that A-B-A structure. Another place that you'll frequently encounter compound ternary forms is in anything that says that it has a trio. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but this is a good guideline to go by. So, for instance, we're talking about pieces in which there's a main section, then a trio serving as that contrasting middle, and then a return to the main section. Common examples of this include the minuet in trio, the scherzo in trio, and the march in trio, especially when we're talking about a European march specifically. Trios sometimes feature only 3 instruments or a thinner texture. Originally, they literally did only feature 3 instruments, hence the name. But as the name kind of caught on with other genres that don't necessarily have more than 1 instrument, so for example, keyboard pieces that have a trio, or larger works that have many instruments in the ensemble, but it's just represented by having a thinning of the texture. So in any event, usually the trio, especially if we're talking about a minuet in trio and a scherzo in trio, will have a much lighter, thinner texture. This is not necessarily the case for a march in trio, though it is not uncommon to have at least a softer dynamic and a slight thinning of the texture at the beginning of a trio. Now, the reason that I specify that this is the European version is that a European march most typically has a march followed by a trio followed by a return to the march. This is in contrast to the American march, which basically just has a march and then a trio, ending with that 2-part form without the return to the original march proper at the end of the piece. Another place that you'll likely encounter compound ternary forms are in character pieces. These include all of the common character pieces from the 19th century, such as mazurkas, nocturnes, romances. Now, not all of these are necessarily going to be in compound ternary, but many of them are, and it is one common place for this form to occur. Next, let's talk a little bit about common key schemes in compound ternary movements. One common option is for all 3 of the main sections, A, B, and A, to be in the same key. This is particularly common in minuet and trio movements. Another option is to combine parallel keys, either having the outer sections in major and the inner section in minor, or the outer sections in minor and the inner sections in major, keeping the same tonic pitch throughout the movement. Going to the subdominant for the middle contrasting section is also a common option, particularly if we're talking about European marches. Although the 3 that I've listed here are the most common options, there are many other possibilities, whether we're talking about the contrasting middle being in a closely related key or even in a distantly related key. Our first example is a pair of minuets from Rameau's Les Indes Galantes. I'll first discuss each minuet in turn, and then we'll talk about the movement as a whole. As you can see from the form diagram, this minuet is in binary form. The first section, represented with a lowercase a, lasts from bars 1 through 8, ending with a half cadence, and the second section, represented with a prime, is from 9 through 24, ending with a PAC. Let's listen to the very opening of this movement. The very opening motive of the piece returns at the beginning of the second half, and indeed this head motive does return throughout both halves in a number of guises. This is one of the things that makes this particular minuet a parallel form. Let's listen to the start of the second section. As you noticed, the first and the second sections, while beginning with the same head motive, do not begin with the same harmony. Because of that, this minuet is a good example of a continuous, parallel, not balanced binary form. It's continuous because the first half ends with a half cadence, so it does not end with an authentic cadence and tonic. It's parallel because the first and the second halves have roughly the same thematic content using the same motives, though in different ways. It's not balanced because the two parts end with very different material. You can tell that even in this form diagram just based on the fact that they have different cadences, and it's a binary form because it has two pieces, each of which are repeated. The minuet as a whole, though, is tonally closed. The minuet starts in G major and it ends with a perfect authentic cadence in G major. Next, let's take a look at minuet 2. While the first minuet was in G major, the second minuet is in G minor. So it shifted from the tonic major to the tonic minor to its parallel key here. Let's listen to the opening of this minuet. Like the first minuet, the second minuet starts with an opening head motive that is repeated at the beginning of the second section. Let's listen to that. As you might have noticed in that recording, the instrumentalists are not playing the notes perfectly even. This is very typical of French Baroque music, to play it with what's known as note inégale, unequal notes. It's basically the Baroque version of swing, if you want to think of it that way. Now let's talk about the form of minuet 2. This is an example of a continuous, parallel, balanced binary form. It's continuous because the first section is not tonally closed. In this case, it doesn't even stay in the same key. It starts in G minor and modulates to B flat major. It's parallel because the first and the second halves use the same thematic material. We have some motivic material that's shared, but the harmonic reworking is pretty thorough here. It's balanced because the end of the two sections are very similar to one another, allowing for transposition, of course. That's not something that by itself is obvious from this form diagram, but if you do check this against the score in the recording, you'll see that it does indeed end with the same material in both cases. And of course, it's a binary form because it has two sections, each of which are repeated. As a whole, this minuet is also tonally closed in the parallel minor in comparison to minuet 1. It starts in G minor, it ends in G minor, and it has a perfect authentic cadence. So even though the minuet does modulate, it has those internal modulations to B flat major a few times, what we're looking at when determining whether something is tonally closed is the starting key and the ending key, and then the final cadence of that passage. Now let's consider what happens in the movement as a whole. A full performance of this movement would feature the first minuet all the way through, complete with repeats, the second minuet all the way through, complete with repeats, and then going back to the first minuet all the way through. Now, whether the repeats are included that second time is really up to the performers. There is a long tradition of just dropping the repeats that second pass through the minuet. So as a whole, we have minuet 1, then 2, then back to 1. As a whole, the entire movement featuring all three of those sections is an example of full sectional compound ternary. Minuet 1 is tonally closed, minuet 2 is tonally closed, and then minuet 1 on its repeats is still tonally closed. So that's what makes it full sectional, that all three of those passages are tonally closed. What makes it compound is that both the minuet 1 is a binary form and minuet 2 is a binary form. So we have binary forms that are being added together to create an overall ternary form. And as I mentioned earlier, the repeats may be dropped during the second pass through minuet 1. And that's true for any other compound ternary form. Oftentimes, if the reprise of the first section is pretty literal, the tendency is to drop the repeats on that second pass through. Now let's move on to Chopin's Raindrop Prelude. Let's start by listening to the very first phrase of this piece. This prelude is in D flat major, and this first phrase ends with a perfect authentic cadence. Let's contrast that with what happens at the very end of this A section, and I do mean that same opening A section here. It's still in D flat major, but this time that phrase ends with a half cadence. Since this is the very end of the section, it means that this initial A portion within this prelude is left tonally open. The B section opens in C sharp minor. Now on the page it looks really strange to go from 5 flats to 4 sharps, but if you think about it, it makes sense. D flat is enharmonically respelled as C sharp here, just because C sharp minor is generally easier to read in than D flat minor is. So we've just gone from the tonic major to the enharmonic parallel minor in this case. You'll notice that even the repeated A flats become the repeated G sharps in the middle register of the piano here. These gently repeated eighth notes are actually what gives this particular prelude its name, as some people hear this as the steady drumbeat of raindrops. Let's listen to this section. So this will start at measure 24, the end of the A section, and dovetail into the beginning of the B section. Next, we'll take a closer look at the form of the Raindrop Prelude. We'll start by considering the A section, which is a simple ternary form. As you can see with the lowercase letters, there's 3 sections. The small a is entirely in D flat major, ending with a perfect authentic cadence, so this is actually the only tonally closed out of the 3 segments of this simple ternary form. The B section explores the modally mixture-related key of A flat minor, so the minor dominant, and then it proceeds on to B flat minor by the end of it, which is obviously closely related. In this case, it's just the 6th, the submedian key in relation to D flat major. Then finally, it ends on a half cadence, preparing for the return of A prime. A prime, like A in the beginning, is in D flat major, but this time, as we discovered on the previous slide, ends with a half cadence. So that very end is the primary difference between the opening A section and the closing A section here. The reason I put continuous with a question mark is because this is one of those interesting examples of a ternary form where 2 of the sections are left tonally open, but it's actually the last A section rather than the first A section. Obviously, this is only possible when you're dealing with a nested simple ternary somewhere in the beginning or middle of a piece, because this wouldn't typically happen at the end of a piece. So as a whole, this A section is left tonally open. It starts and ends in the same key, but the half cadence precludes any sort of arrival of tonal closure at the end of the section. Now let's consider the B section. The B section is a continuous, simple, not balanced binary form. It's not obvious that it is a binary form from just looking at the score at first glance, because the individual sections of the binary form are written out rather than just flanked by repeat signs. So as you can see on the form diagram, there's a small section C that is immediately repeated. That repeat is pretty literal. Chopin could have used repeat signs if he had wished to. The second one, however, is a little bit different because we have a D section followed by a D prime section, and that D prime section is substantially changed, so it's not just a literal repeat. As a whole, this B section is tonally open. It starts in C sharp minor, it ends in C sharp major, but significantly it ends with a half cadence. Once again, not reaching that tonal closure of arriving on the tonic chord in addition to being in a tonic key. We've already talked about how the B section starts and ends in a C sharp key, which is basically an enharmonic spelling of D flat. But another interesting enharmonic spelling is that the A flat minor of the original A section is echoed by the G sharp minor, which again is just the same key enharmonically spelled in the B section. The A prime in this particular piece is drastically truncated. So as opposed to recapitulating all of that original A section, Chopin elects to bring back just a small segment from this that's been reworked. And this A prime section is not in a ternary or a binary form. And specifically, it reworks that small A theme from the opening. Zooming out to the piece as a whole, this entire prelude is a continuous compound ternary. The initial A section is tonally open, the B section is tonally open, and it's only that final A prime section, as truncated as it is, that finally reaches tonal closure, ending with an IAC at the end of the piece. To summarize, compound ternary is an ABA form that has nested forms inside of it. Specifically, at least one of the A sections will be binary or ternary, and typically the B section will also be binary or ternary as well. Most of the time, compound ternary movements are full sectional, meaning that all three sections are tonally closed. We saw this in the Rameau example in this video. However, that is not always the case. As the Chopin example illustrates, it is possible to have a continuous compound ternary. As in simple ternary, the return to A might be altered. Again, this is something that we saw clearly with the Chopin example, where it was barely 1/3 of the amount of material from the original A section that was brought back, and there were some reworkings in terms of cadence types. Together, these two pieces illustrate some of the most common features as well as some of the most interesting alternative options in the context of a compound ternary form.